The morning of July 3, 2025, dawned with an eerie stillness across North Texas. Governor Greg Abbott sat in his Austin office, wheelchair positioned at his mahogany desk, reviewing the latest weather reports with the same methodical precision that had defined his political career for over 2 decades. The meteorologist's words painted a grim picture. Unprecedented rainfall was heading toward the heart of Texas. "Governor, the National Weather Service is calling this a once-in-a-century event," said Chief of Staff Maria Gonzalez, her voice tight with concern as she placed the updated forecast on his desk. "They're predicting up to 15 inches of rain in some areas over the next 48 hours. Abbott's weathered hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, his steel gray eyes scanning the satellite images. At 67, he had weathered many storms, both literal and political. The accident that had left him paralyzed at 26 had taught him that life's greatest challenges often come without warning, but they also revealed the true character of those who face them. "Maria, get me Director Thompson from Emergency Management." On the line, Abbott commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had served Texas through Hurricane Harvey, the 2021 winter storm, and countless other crises. "And I want a direct line to the National Guard. If this forecast is accurate, we need to be ready to move fast." Outside his window, the Texas state capitol stood proud against increasingly dark clouds. Abbott had spent his entire adult life in service to this state, first as a judge, then as Attorney General for 12 years, and now in his 10th year as governor. Texas wasn't just his home, it was his calling, his purpose, his very identity. The phone rang. Cutting through his thoughts, Governor Abbott, came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell from the Texas National Guard. "Sir, we've got 2,000 troops on standby, and we're coordinating with local emergency services across the affected regions. Dallas and Fort Worth are particularly concerned about their river systems." Abbott nodded. Though Mitchell couldn't see him, "Colonel, I want you to understand something. Every life in this state matters. Every family, every community, they're all counting on us. I don't care what it takes or what it costs. We protect our people." As the first drops of rain began to streak down his office windows, Abbott felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had built his career on the principle that government exists to serve and protect its citizens. And now, as the storm clouds gathered, he knew that principle would be tested like never before. "Maria," he called out, "cancel all my appointments for the next week and get me the emergency broadcast equipment. If this storm is as bad as they're predicting, the people of Texas need to hear from their governor." The rain was falling harder, now drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Abbott closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer for the safety of his fellow Texans. When he opened them again, his resolve was absolute. Whatever was coming, Texas would face it together, and he would be right there with them, leading from the front as he always had. By dawn on July 4th, the nightmare had begun. Abbott's phone buzzed incessantly with reports from across North Texas. The Trinity River was rising faster than anyone had predicted, and in Dallas, entire neighborhoods were being swallowed by muddy, rushing water. "Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below. And leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue." "Governor, we've got a situation in East Dallas," crackled the voice of Fire Chief Roberto Sanchez through the emergency radio. "The water came up so fast, we've got families trapped on rooftops. We need every available helicopter, boat, and rescue team you can send us." Abbott was already in the Emergency Operations Center, having spent the night there as reports poured in from across the state. His wheelchair was positioned at the center of a semicircle of monitors, each showing different aspects of the unfolding disaster. The images were devastating. Cars floating down what used to be streets, houses with only their roofs visible above the waterline, and people desperately waving from second-story windows. "Chief Sanchez, you've got whatever you need," Abbott replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. I'm authorizing the immediate deployment of all available National Guard units. And I want every agency, state, local, federal, working together on this. No red tape, no bureaucracy. Lives first, paperwork later. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell approached, his face grim. Governor, we're getting reports that the situation in Tyler and Longview is even worse. Some areas got hit with flash flooding, so severe that entire mobile home parks have been swept away. The water rose 10 feet in less than 10 minutes. Abbott felt his jaw tighten. 40 years of public service had taught him to compartmentalize emotion during a crisis. But seeing his beloved Texas under assault by nature's fury tested even his iron discipline. Colonel, I want search and rescue teams deployed to every affected area, and I want our best helicopter pilots in the air, weather permitting, looking for survivors. Emergency Manager Sarah Williams rushed over with an update that made Abbott's blood run cold. Governor, we're getting reports of at least 30 fatalities so far, and that number is climbing. The Red Cross is setting up emergency shelters, but we're going to need more space, a lot more. Abbott nodded grimly. Sarah, contact every church, community center, and school in the unaffected areas. We're going to need every bed, every meal, every helping hand we can get. And I want to address the state tonight. People need to know that their government is fighting for them. The hours that followed were a blur of emergency calls, resource deployments, and heartbreaking reports from the field. Abbott watched the monitors as rescue boats navigated through what had once been suburban streets, their crews pulling terrified families from flooded homes. In one particularly moving scene, a team of volunteers formed a human chain to rescue an elderly man from his submerged car. That's Texas right there, Abbott murmured to himself, watching the rescue unfold. When the chips are down, we don't wait for someone else to help. We help each other. As the sun set on July 4th, normally a day of celebration, Abbott prepared for his evening address to the state. The teleprompter was set up, the cameras were rolling, and millions of Texans were waiting to hear from their governor. But as he looked into the camera, Abbott pushed the teleprompter aside. This message needed to come from the heart. My fellow Texans, he began, his voice carrying the weight of the day's tragedy, but also the strength of his unshakable resolve. Today, our great state has been tested by forces beyond our control. But I want you to know this, we will not bow, we will not break, and we will not abandon each other. Not now, not ever. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the Emergency Operations Center, the work of rebuilding Texas had already begun. The morning of July 5th brought no relief from the relentless downpour. Abbott had barely slept, choosing instead to remain at his post in the Emergency Operations Center, coordinating rescue efforts that had now expanded to cover nearly a dozen counties. Across North Texas, his shirt was wrinkled, his tie loosened, but his eyes remained sharp and focused. Governor, we've got some good news for once, announced Captain Lisa Rodriguez from the Texas Department of Public Safety. The volunteer rescue efforts are incredible. We've got bass boat owners, kayakers, even people with pool floats helping. With evacuations in the shallower areas, the community response has been extraordinary. Abbott's weathered face broke into the first smile he'd managed in days. That's the Texas spirit. Captain, tell me more about what you're seeing out there. Rodriguez pulled up footage on one of the monitors. Sir, in Richardson, we've got a group of high school kids who've been going door to door in their neighborhood with canoes, evacuating elderly residents. In Plano, the local churches have organized a food distribution network that's feeding thousands of displaced families. And in Fort Worth, a group of off-duty firefighters and EMTs from other states have driven in on their own time to help. The images on the screen showed story after story of ordinary Texans rising to extraordinary challenges. A grandfather carrying his granddaughter through chest-deep water. A group of strangers lifting a wheelchair-bound woman to safety. Neighbors sharing their last dry clothes with families who had lost everything. Governor, interrupted Chief of Staff Maria Gonzalez, holding up her phone. President Trump is on the line. He wants to speak with you about federal assistance. Abbott nodded and took the call. Mr. President, thank you for calling. We could use all the help we can get down here. Governor Abbott, I've been watching the news, and I want you to know that you have the full support of the federal government." Came the familiar voice. "I'm authorizing FEMA to provide immediate emergency assistance, and I'm sending additional National Guard units from neighboring states. You just tell me what you need. Mr. President, I appreciate that more than you know. Right now, we need more helicopters for rescue operations, temporary housing for displaced families, and medical supplies for the shelters. And sir, when this immediate crisis is over, we're going to need long-term support for rebuilding." After the call ended, Abbott turned his attention back to the rescue coordination. The death toll had risen to 60, with dozens still missing, but the heroism he was witnessing gave him hope. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell approached with an update from the field. "Governor, we just got word from Tyler. A group of local ranchers with high water vehicles has been working with our teams to evacuate a nursing home that got cut off by the flooding. They made 17 trips, and they got every single resident out safely. The oldest was 94 years old. Abbott felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Colonel, I want to meet these people when this is over. I want to look them in the eye and thank them personally." As the day wore on, Abbott made the decision that would define his leadership. During the crisis, against the advice of his security team, he announced that he would personally visit the affected areas the next day. "A leader leads from the front," he told his staff. "These people need to know that their governor is with them, not just managing the crisis from Austin." The rain was finally beginning to ease as evening approached, but Abbott knew the hardest work was still ahead. The floodwaters would eventually recede, but the task of rebuilding lives, homes, and communities would take years. As he prepared for another long night of coordination and planning, Abbott reflected on the events of the past 3 days. Texas had been tested, but it had not been broken. In the face of nature's fury, the state had revealed its true character, not in the power of the storm, but in the strength of its people. And as governor, Abbott was determined to ensure that strength would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. "Maria," he called out as the sun set on another day of crisis, "I want to visit every affected community. I want to see the damage, meet the victims, and thank the heroes. The people of Texas deserve to know that their government stands with them." The flood was far from over, but Abbott's resolve had never been stronger. Texas would rebuild, and it would be stronger than ever. July 6 dawned gray and humid. The rain finally reduced to a steady drizzle after 3 days of torrential downpour. Governor Abbott's motorcade made its way through the devastated streets of East Dallas, where the Trinity River had reclaimed entire neighborhoods. The sight that greeted him was unlike anything he had witnessed in his decades of public service. "Sweet Lord," Abbott murmured as his vehicle stopped at what had once been a thriving residential area. Now, cars sat upside down against houses, their windows shattered and interiors filled with mud. A children's playground was twisted into unrecognizable metal, and everywhere he looked, people were emerging from shelters to survey the destruction of their lives. Abbott's wheelchair was carefully lowered from the specially equipped vehicle, and immediately he was surrounded by residents who had lost everything. But instead of anger or despair, he found something that reminded him why he loved Texas so deeply: resilience and determination. Governor Abbott called out Maria Santos, a single mother holding her 8-year-old daughter's hand. "Thank you for coming. We lost our house, but we're alive, and that's what matters." The neighbors, the volunteers, the rescue teams, everyone's been incredible. Abbott reached out and took the woman's free hand. "Ma'am, I want you to know that the state of Texas is going to stand by you and your daughter. We're going to rebuild, and we're going to rebuild stronger. That's a promise." As he moved through the neighborhood, Abbott was struck by the stories of heroism that seemed to emerge from every conversation. Mrs. Johnson, an 82-year-old retired teacher, had sheltered 6 families in her 2-story home when the waters rose. The Hernandez family had used their pickup truck to ferry elderly neighbors to safety before their own home was flooded. Teenagers from the local high school had organized supply runs to isolated areas. Governor said. Fire Chief Sanchez joining Abbott's tour. "I've been in emergency services for 25 years. And I've never seen anything like this community response. We had so many volunteers showing up to help that we had to start turning people away because we couldn't coordinate them all." Abbott nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Chief, that's the Texas I know. When the chips are down, we don't wait for someone else to solve the problem. We solve it ourselves together." The tour continued through Tyler, where the devastation was even more severe. An entire trailer park had been swept away, leaving only concrete foundations and scattered debris. But even here, Abbott found hope. A group of local churches had established a massive relief center, providing not just food and shelter, but also medical care, counseling, and help filing insurance claims. Governor Abbott called out Pastor William Jackson, a tall man with kind eyes and mud-stained clothes. "We've been working around the clock since the waters started rising. Our congregation, along with about a dozen other churches, we've got over 1,000 people housed and fed. Nobody goes hungry, nobody sleeps outside." Abbott gripped the pastor's hand firmly. "Pastor Jackson, you and your community are living proof of what makes Texas special. The federal government can send money and supplies, but it can't send heart. That comes from people like you." As the day wore on, Abbott visited shelter after shelter, meeting with families who had lost everything but maintained their dignity and hope. He listened to stories of loss and heroism, taking careful notes on what resources were needed most urgently. But it was a conversation with a young father that would stay with him for years to come. "Governor," said Tommy Peterson, a construction worker holding his 4-year-old son, "I know people are probably wondering why we stay here, why we rebuild in places that flood. But this is our home. This is where our families are buried, where our kids go to school, where we know our neighbors' names. A storm can destroy our houses, but it can't destroy our community." Abbott looked at the man and his son, seeing in them the very essence of what it meant to be Texan. "Tommy, you just explained better than any politician ever could why Texas is worth fighting for. And I want you to know, we're going to fight for you." As the sun set on another day of crisis, Abbott returned to the Emergency Operations Center with renewed purpose. The statistics were grim to 75 confirmed deaths, hundreds still missing, thousands homeless. But the human stories he had witnessed that day told a different tale. Texas had been wounded, but its spirit remained unbroken. July 7th brought not just the continuing challenge of flood recovery, but also the inevitable political scrutiny that follows any major disaster. Abbott was back in his Austin office, having spent the night reviewing damage assessments and coordinating with federal agencies, when his communications director burst through the door. "Governor, we've got a problem," announced Jake Morrison, holding up his tablet. "The opposition is going hard on social media. They're claiming your administration was unprepared, that the early warning systems failed, that you prioritized politics over people. Senator Williams is calling for a congressional investigation." Abbott's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "Jake, let me be clear about something. While we've been pulling people out of floodwaters and saving lives, some folks apparently think this is a good time to play political games. That tells you everything you need to know about their priorities." The criticism was predictable, but no less frustrating. Abbott had weathered political storms before: attacks on his border security policies, criticism of his handling of the 2021 winter storm, constant battles over federal overreach. But this felt different. This was an attack on his response to genuine human suffering. "Governor," interrupted Chief of Staff Maria Gonzalez, "we've got Senator Cruz on line 1, and the president wants to schedule a joint press conference for this afternoon. Also, CNN is requesting an interview about the administration's disaster response." Abbott considered his options carefully. His political instincts, honed over decades in Texas politics, told him that perception could be as important as reality in situations like this. But his conscience told him that his focus should remain on the people still in need. "Maria, here's what we're going to do. I'll talk to Senator Cruz and coordinate with the president's team. As for CNN, I'll do the interview, but only if they agree to focus on the relief efforts and the needs of the victims. I'm not going to waste time on political theater while people are still suffering." The phone call with Senator Ted Cruz was encouraging. Despite their occasional political differences, Cruz was fully supportive of Abbott's response and offered to help secure additional federal resources. "Greg, you're doing exactly what a governor should do in a crisis like this. Don't let the political noise distract you from the real work." The president's joint press conference was scheduled for 3 p.m., and Abbott knew it would be a crucial moment. The national media would be watching, and his words would be scrutinized by both supporters and critics. But as he prepared his remarks, Abbott kept thinking about the faces he had seen the day before: the determined mother, the selfless pastor, the proud father who refused to give up on his community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Abbott began when the cameras started rolling, "I want to address the political criticism that some have leveled against our disaster response. To those who think this is an appropriate time for partisan attacks, I have a simple message. Come to Texas. Walk through the neighborhoods I walked through yesterday. Look into the eyes of the families who have lost everything but still maintain their hope and dignity. Then tell me whether you think politics should be our priority right now." The press conference was a success, with both Abbott and President Trump presenting a united front on the need for immediate and long-term federal assistance. But it was Abbott's closing statement that would be remembered. "I've been in public service for over 30 years, and I've learned that leadership isn't about taking credit when things go well. It's about taking responsibility when things go wrong. If there were mistakes in our preparation or response, we'll identify them and fix them. But right now, my focus is on the people of Texas, and it will remain there until every family has a roof over their heads and every community is rebuilt." After the press conference, Abbott retreated to his office to review the latest casualty reports. The death toll had risen to 85, with 40 people still missing. Each number represented a family destroyed, a life cut short, a community diminished. The political attacks seemed petty and meaningless in comparison. "Governor," said Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, entering the office with the latest field reports, "I wanted you to know that the search and rescue teams are reporting some success. We found 3 survivors today who had been trapped for days, and the volunteer coordination is getting more efficient. We've got over 10,000 people registered to help with cleanup and rebuilding." Abbott nodded. "Grateful for any good news. Colonel, I want you to know that what you and your teams have done over the past 5 days represents the very best of Texas. Politics may come and go, but the lives you've saved will be remembered forever." As the day ended, Abbott reflected on the dual nature of crisis leadership. While his teams were performing miracles in the field, he was also fighting a battle for public perception and political survival. But his priorities remained clear: people first, politics later. By July 8th, the immediate crisis had evolved into a long-term challenge that would test every aspect of Abbott's leadership. The floodwaters were finally receding, revealing the full scope of the devastation. Entire neighborhoods looked like war zones, with debris scattered for miles and the smell of mud and loss hanging heavy in the humid air. Abbott had established a forward command post in Dallas, operating out of a FEMA trailer that had been set up in the parking lot of a damaged school. From here, he could coordinate directly with local officials, federal agencies, and the countless volunteer organizations that had converged on North Texas. "Governor, we need to talk about the long-term housing situation," said Sarah Williams, the emergency management director, spreading maps and charts across the small table in the trailer. "We've got over 15,000 people in temporary shelters, but we can't keep them in gymnasiums and church basements indefinitely. Some of these folks won't be able to return to their homes for months, if ever." Abbott studied the numbers grimly. The scale of displacement was unprecedented in Texas history. "Sarah, what are our options? And I want real solutions, not bureaucratic band-aids." "Well, sir, FEMA is providing temporary housing units, but they're slow to deploy and insufficient for our needs. We're looking at mobile home parks, converted apartment complexes, even considering temporary communities built from scratch. The challenge is finding suitable land and getting through the permitting process quickly." Abbott's political experience had taught him that bureaucracy was often the biggest obstacle to effective disaster response. "Sarah, I want you to work with the Attorney General's office to identify every regulatory barrier that's slowing us down. If we need to suspend certain permitting requirements or cut through red tape, we'll do it. People need homes, not paperwork. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the trailer door. Jake Morrison, the communications director, entered with a concerned expression. "Governor, we've got a situation developing. There's a group of protesters outside the hotel where you're staying tonight. They're angry about the government response, claiming that wealthy neighborhoods got priority treatment during the rescues." Abbott sighed. He had been expecting this. In any major disaster, there were always complaints about equity and fairness in the response. Sometimes these concerns were valid, sometimes they were politically motivated, but they always had to be addressed seriously. "Jake, I want to meet with the protest leaders, not in some formal setting, but right here, right now. If they have legitimate concerns, I want to hear them. And if they're just trying to make political points, I want to look them in the eye and tell them how I really feel about that." An hour later, Abbott found himself face to face with a group of community activists from some of the hardest hit areas. The conversation was tense but respectful, with the protesters raising concerns about response times in predominantly Hispanic neighborhoods and the availability of Spanish-language emergency information. "Governor Abbott," said Carmen Rodriguez, a local community organizer, "we appreciate that you came to listen to us, but we need to see action. Our people were some of the last to be evacuated, and now they're some of the last to get assistance. That's not right." Abbott listened carefully, taking notes on his tablet. "Ms. Rodriguez, you're absolutely right that it's not acceptable if any community felt forgotten or ignored. I want you to work directly with my staff to identify specific problems and solutions. And I want you to know that I will personally review every policy and procedure to ensure we're serving all Texans equally." The meeting lasted 2 hours, with Abbott hearing story after story of bureaucratic delays, communication failures, and resource shortages. But he also heard about the incredible resilience of communities that had been hit hardest, and the determination of people who refused to give up, despite facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. As the protesters prepared to leave, Carmen Rodriguez approached Abbott privately. "Governor, I want you to know that even though we have our differences, we appreciate that you listen to us. That means something." Abbott nodded. "Ma'am, I may be the governor of Texas, but I'm also a public servant. Part of my job is to listen, especially when people are hurting. Thank you for coming here today." Later that evening, Abbott held a conference call with the state's congressional delegation, outlining the resources needed for long-term recovery. The conversation was encouraging, with both Republican and Democratic representatives pledging to work together on federal disaster relief legislation. "Governor," said Congressman Martinez, "I want you to know that you have our full support. This isn't about party politics, it's about helping Texas recover. We'll fight for every dollar of federal assistance you need." As Abbott prepared for another night of crisis management, he reflected on the complexity of disaster leadership. The immediate heroism of the rescue phase was giving way to the harder, longer work of rebuilding communities and restoring hope. But the conversations of the day had reminded him why he had chosen public service in the first place: to make a real difference in people's lives. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Abbott was confident that Texas would emerge stronger than before. The floods had tested the state's character, and that character had proved unbreakable. 3 weeks after the floods began, Governor Abbott stood in the ruins of what had once been the Riverside Elementary School in Tyler. The building was a total loss, its walls buckled, its classrooms filled with debris, its playground equipment scattered across what remained of the parking lot. But Abbott wasn't there to mourn the destruction. He was there to announce the future. "Ladies and gentlemen," Abbott addressed the crowd of parents, teachers, and community leaders who had gathered in the hot July sun. "When I look at this school, I don't see destruction. I see opportunity. We're not just going to rebuild Riverside Elementary, we're going to build it better, stronger, and more prepared for whatever challenges the future might bring." The crowd erupted in applause, but Abbott could see the skepticism in some faces. These people had heard politicians make promises before, and many had been disappointed. But Abbott had spent the past 3 weeks working 18-hour days to turn promises into action, and he had results to show for it. Maria. He called to his chief of staff, who stood nearby with a thick folder of documents. Tell them about the funding. Maria Gonzalez stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. Thanks to Governor Abbott's negotiations with the federal government and the unanimous support of our state legislature, we have secured $2.8 billion in immediate reconstruction funding. Of that amount, $400 million is specifically designated for school reconstruction and improvement. The crowd's energy shifted from polite attention to genuine excitement. These weren't just numbers on a budget sheet. They represented hope for their children's future. But Abbott wasn't finished. I also want you to meet someone special, he said, gesturing toward a tall man in work clothes who had been standing quietly at the edge of the crowd. This is Robert Chen, the architect who designed the disaster-resistant schools that performed so well during Hurricane Harvey. Mr. Chen has agreed to personally oversee the reconstruction of every school damaged in these floods. Robert Chen stepped forward, his voice humble but confident. Governor Abbott asked me to build schools that could withstand anything Mother Nature throws at them, but more than that, he asked me to build schools that inspire learning, that bring communities together, and that serve as symbols of hope. That's exactly what we're going to do here in Tyler. As the formal announcement concluded, Abbott spent time walking through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to individual concerns. It was here, in these one-on-one conversations, that he often learned the most about what people really needed. Governor, said Jonna Morrison, a third-grade teacher whose classroom had been on the ground floor of the destroyed school. I lost everything in that flood, my teaching materials, my students' work, even the class pet. But you know what? My kids are still excited about learning. They keep asking when they can come back to school. Abbott felt his throat tighten with emotion. Mrs. Morrison, I promise you this, when that new school opens its doors, it's going to be the finest elementary school in East Texas. Your students deserve nothing less. The teacher smiled through tears. Governor, that means the world to me. But more than the building, what matters is that you didn't forget about us. You didn't just make promises and disappear. You stayed, and you're still here. That evening, Abbott returned to his temporary command post to review progress reports. From across the affected region, the statistics were encouraging. To 95% of displaced families now had temporary housing. Power had been restored to 80% of affected areas, and debris removal was ahead of schedule. But Abbott knew that behind every statistic was a human story, and many of those stories were still unfolding. Governor, said Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, entering with the daily briefing, I've got some good news from the field. The volunteer coordination system we set up is working so well that other states are asking to study it. We've processed over 50,000 volunteer applications and coordinated more than 2 million hours of community service. Abbott nodded with satisfaction. Colonel, that's the Texas way. When our neighbors need help, we don't wait for someone else to act. We roll up our sleeves and get to work. As the sun set on another day of recovery efforts, Abbott reflected on how much had changed since that first morning, when the weather reports had warned of unprecedented rainfall. The immediate crisis had passed, but the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding communities wasn't just about constructing new buildings. It was about restoring hope, strengthening bonds, and preparing for whatever challenges the future might bring. 1 month after the floods, Abbott decided to return to the neighborhoods he had visited during the immediate aftermath of the disaster. This time, however, he came not as a crisis manager, but as a witness to the remarkable transformation that was already taking place across North Texas. His first stop was the East Dallas neighborhood where he had met Maria Santos and her daughter. As his motorcade pulled up to what had once been a scene of utter devastation, Abbott was amazed by what he saw. Where there had been debris and mud, there were now construction crews and heavy equipment. Where there had been despair, there was now the bustling energy of a community rebuilding itself. Governor Abbott called a familiar voice. Maria Santos approached, but she looked completely different from the desperate woman he had met a month earlier. She was wearing a hard hat and work clothes, and her face radiated confidence and determination. Mrs. Santos, Abbott said, genuinely surprised you look like you're ready to build something." Maria laughed, a sound that Abbott found incredibly moving after everything she had been through. "Governor, remember how you promised that we'd rebuild stronger? Well, I decided I wasn't going to wait for someone else to do it for me. I'm part of the construction crew rebuilding my own neighborhood." Abbott learned that Maria had enrolled in an accelerated construction training program that the state had established specifically for flood victims. Not only was she earning good wages while learning valuable skills, but she was also helping to rebuild her own community. Her daughter was thriving in the temporary school that had been set up in a nearby community center. "Governor," Maria continued, "I want to show you something." She led Abbott to a small section of new foundation that was being poured for what would become her new home. "This house is going to be elevated to feet higher than my old one, and it's going to have special flood-resistant features. But more than that, it's going to be built by people who care about this community because we live here." The next stop was Tyler, where Abbott visited Pastor William Jackson's church. The congregation had not only continued their relief efforts, but had expanded them into a comprehensive community development program. The church basement had been converted into a job training center, and the fellowship hall now housed a food bank that served 3 counties. "Governor Abbott," Pastor Jackson said as he showed Abbott around the expanded facilities, "when the flood hit, we thought we were just responding to an emergency. But what we discovered is that our community had needs that went far beyond flood damage, so we decided to address all of them." Abbott was particularly impressed by the job training programs. Former flood victims were learning everything from electrical work to computer skills, and many were finding employment with the companies that had been hired for reconstruction work. The church had also established a microloan program to help small business owners rebuild and expand. Pastor Abbott said, "What you've done here goes far beyond disaster relief. You've created a model for community development that other places should study." Pastor Jackson smiled humbly, "Governor, all we did was apply the principle you taught us during the crisis. We don't wait for someone else to solve our problems. We solve them ourselves together." The final stop of the day was the site where the new Riverside Elementary School was being constructed. Abbott was amazed by the progress. The foundation was complete, and the frame was already taking shape. But what impressed him most was the group of people who had gathered to watch the construction. "Governor," called Tommy Peterson, the construction worker Abbott had met during the immediate aftermath of the flood, "I wanted you to see this." Tommy's 4-year-old son was now 5 and excited about starting kindergarten in the new school. "Mr. Peterson," Abbott replied, "how are you and your family doing?" Tommy's face broke into a proud grin. "Governor, we're doing better than ever. I got hired as a supervisor on this construction project, and my wife started a business helping other families navigate the insurance and rebuilding process. But more than that, this whole experience has brought our community closer together." As Abbott looked around at the construction site, he saw something that filled him with pride. The workers weren't just building a school, they were building a symbol of their community's resilience and determination. Many of the workers were local residents who had lost their own homes in the flood, but had chosen to prioritize rebuilding their children's school. "Governor," said Robert Chen, the architect who was overseeing the project, "I've built schools all over the world, but I've never worked on a project where the community was so invested in the outcome. These people don't just want a school, they want a symbol of hope for their children's future." As the day ended, Abbott reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. The flood had been a tragedy, but it had also revealed the incredible strength and character of the Texas people. Communities that had been devastated just a month earlier were now rebuilding themselves stronger and more united than before. 6 months after the Great Flood of 2025, Governor Abbott stood before a joint session of the Texas legislature to deliver what would be remembered as one of the most important speeches of his political career. The state capitol was packed with legislators, flood survivors, first responders, and volunteers who had been part of the recovery effort. As Abbott approached the podium, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. The immediate crisis had lasted only days, but the recovery had revealed truths about Texas that would shape the state's future for generations to come. Mr. Speaker, Lieutenant Governor, distinguished members of the legislature, and fellow Texans, Abbott began, his voice carrying the weight of everything he had experienced over the past 6 months. I stand before you today not just as your governor, but as a witness to the most remarkable display of courage, resilience, and community spirit that I have ever seen. The chamber was completely silent as Abbott continued. On July 3rd of this year, Mother Nature tested our state with unprecedented fury. 91 of our fellow Texans lost their lives. Thousands of families lost their homes. Entire communities were wiped off the map. By any measure, it was a tragedy of historic proportions. Abbott paused, letting the gravity of those numbers sink in. But today, I'm not here to talk about what we lost. I'm here to talk about what we found. The governor gestured toward the gallery, where many of the heroes of the flood recovery were seated. We found Maria Santos, a single mother who didn't just rebuild her life. She learned new skills and helped rebuild her entire neighborhood. We found Pastor William Jackson, whose church became not just a shelter for flood victims, but a model for community development that's now being studied by organizations around the world. Abbott's voice grew stronger as he continued. We found Tommy Peterson, who lost his home but gained a purpose, helping to build a school that will serve his community for generations. We found thousands of volunteers who didn't wait for someone else to help. They grabbed boats, kayaks, even pool floats, and became first responders themselves. The chamber erupted in sustained applause, but Abbott wasn't finished. But most importantly, we found something that our critics said didn't exist anymore. We found the true spirit of Texas. We found communities that take care of their own. We found neighbors who risk their lives for strangers. We found the kind of courage and determination that built this great state in the first place. Abbott then turned to the political lessons of the crisis. During those dark days, some people wanted to play political games. They wanted to point fingers and assign blame while people were still trapped on rooftops. But the people of Texas showed them what real leadership looks like. Real leadership isn't about taking credit or avoiding responsibility. It's about showing up, doing the work, and never giving up on the people you serve. The governor's voice took on a more personal tone. I want to share something with you that I learned during this crisis. On July 4th, as I watched the floodwaters rise and the death toll climb, I asked myself whether I was strong enough to lead Texas through its darkest hour. But then I realized I was asking the wrong question. The question wasn't whether I was strong enough. The question was whether I was worthy of the people I serve. Abbott paused, his voice thick with emotion. And what I learned is that the people of Texas don't need their governor to be perfect. They need their governor to be present. They need their governor to fight for them, to stand with them, and to never, ever give up on them. The chamber was completely silent now, hanging on every word. 6 months ago, in the midst of that crisis, I made a promise to the people of Texas. I said, we will not bow, we will not break, and we will not abandon each other. Today, I want to expand on that promise. Abbott's voice rose with conviction. As long as I am governor of this great state, I will not abandon Texas, not when the waters rise, not when the storms come, not when the critics attack, not when the challenges seem insurmountable. I will not abandon Texas, because Texas has never abandoned me. The chamber erupted in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes, but Abbott wasn't finished with his speech when the applause finally died down. He continued with the practical business of governance. Today, I am announcing the Texas Resilience Initiative, a comprehensive program to prepare our state for future challenges. We will build our communities stronger, train our citizens better, and create response systems that are the envy of the nation. But more than that, we will remember the lessons that this flood taught us about who we are and what we're capable of achieving when we work together. Abbott outlined a series of specific proposals: enhanced flood control infrastructure, expanded disaster response training for civilians, improved early warning systems, and economic development programs for affected communities. But he also announced something unprecedented: the creation of the Texas Community Resilience Corps, a volunteer organization that would train citizens to respond to future emergencies. The heroes of the Great Flood of 2025 weren't just the Professional first responders, though they were incredible, Abbott said. The heroes were ordinary Texans who saw their neighbors in need and refused to stand by and do nothing. The Texas Community Resilience Corps will ensure that we never lose that spirit of neighborly service. As Abbott concluded his speech, he returned to the personal theme that had defined his leadership during the crisis. My fellow Texans, I have been privileged to serve this state for over 30 years. I have seen us face many challenges, weather many storms, overcome many obstacles. But I have never been more proud to be a Texan than I was during those dark days in July. Abbott's final words were delivered with quiet conviction that filled the chamber. The flood tested our character, and our character proved unbreakable. The critics tested our resolve, and our resolve proved unshakable. The challenge tested our unity, and our unity proved unstoppable. We are Texas. We endure. We overcome. We rebuild. And we never, ever abandon each other. As Abbott left the podium to thunderous applause, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The great flood of 2025 had been a tragedy, but it had also been a revelation. It had shown him and the world what Texas was truly made of. And as he looked toward the future, Abbott was confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, Texas would face them with the same courage, determination, and unity that had carried them through their darkest hour. The flood was over, but the spirit it had revealed would endure forever.